You're listening to Where the Trail Ends podcast, chronicling my ongoing journey to find the truth about my missing friend and an explanation for the apparent evidence of UFOs they left behind. After years spent traveling the country, researching the UFO phenomenon, and interviewing experts and eyewitnesses, I was left with even more questions and decided to share my story and research with the public in the hopes that someone, somewhere, can provide the answers I've been so desperately looking for.
Disclaimer. In April of 2020, the U.S. government released 3 declassified videos of unexplained aerial phenomena taken by Navy personnel in 2004 and 2015.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
Despite the unprecedented government disclosure acknowledging the existence of UFOs, much of society continues to dismiss those who have experienced and even recorded similar events. As a result, some of the names in this podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
I need your help. In 2018, 2 months after a good friend of mine went missing, I discovered what I now believe to be evidence of UFOs that they left behind. Though I'd been a skeptic all my life, I had no choice but to take the phenomenon seriously as I sought to find the truth about my friend's disappearance and an explanation for the evidence that was left in their wake. After several years spent researching UFOs, examining hundreds of hours of footage, and interviewing dozens of experts and eyewitnesses, I was left with even more questions and had run out of places to go looking for answers. Ironically, it was the government's disclosures that made me realize that the time had come to tell my story through this podcast and ask for the public's help. Please, if you have any information or experiences related to any of the phenomena mentioned in this podcast, email wherethetrailendspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you. My friend Owen disappeared from his Springfield, Massachusetts home in the fall of 2018. He was last seen by a neighbor arriving home one night after work. Hours later, another neighbor would hear his car driving off in a hurry in the middle of the night. Several days later, when family members went to his home to check on him, they discovered the front door open and his cell phone and wallet left behind. They saw no evidence to suggest that Owen had packed for or been planning a trip and called the police. Two weeks later, his car would be discovered abandoned in a trailhead parking lot near Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest, with its windows, doors, and sunroof open. Adding to the mystery, police quickly determined that it had only been parked there for 24 hours or less. Authorities searched the area where his car was found, and friends and family continued the search for weeks, but they found no further clues or information about Owen's disappearance. I now believe it's because they were looking in the wrong place. I met Owen in 2011 when I was working at a small startup, and they took their employees for this day-long guided hike and canoe trip, and Owen was one of our tour guides. He had this amazing, gentle way about him, you could tell that he loved being outdoors and was a true student of nature. As we hiked, he would point out all the edible plants and show us the animal tracks and tell us which animals made them. And he had this amazing way of just getting us all really excited about being outside that day. And then a couple years later, in 2013, I was planning my brother's bachelor party, and I knew that he wanted to go camping. So I tracked down Owen, and I hired him as our guide for that trip. And we had a great time. He was, once again, just, the consummate guy, just knowledgeable, informative, and patient, considering we're all a little bit hungover that trip. And I remember at the end of the trip, he and I were talking, and he gave me this list of hikes to try. In the weeks after that trip, I did one of those hikes, and then a couple weeks later, I did another one, and I really just developed this love of hiking and camping, thanks largely to Owen. And then, it would be another 4 years before I would see Owen again. And it was the winter of 2017, and we just randomly crossed paths in this bar in upstate New York. By that time, I'd been hiking and camping a number of times and was really pretty hardcore into it. I thanked him for fostering my love of the outdoors, and I remember buying him a beer just to say thank you. And we just started talking about, all the places that he'd hiked and the places that I'd started hiking. And then we decided that we would try to hike this trail up in New Hampshire, the Black Angel Trail in the White Mountains. And ended up exchanging our info and, making a promise that we'd get together as soon as we could. And that took us about 6 months, but we finally did end up making plans and meeting up for a weekend. And I remember I got to Owen's house the night before so we could get an early start the next day. But I beat him home, and he texted me saying, hey, his buddy next door had a spare key. So I went over and met the neighbor, and Owen and I just ended up hanging out and talking for hours that night. I just remember he just went into his love of foraging, and he made a promise that the next day he'd find these fiddleheads for me to try, because I'd never tried fiddleheads. And so the next morning, got up early, headed up to the mountains, set up our campground, and had a great day of hiking. He did find fiddleheads, and he did make them for dinner, and they weren't bad. Then we just sat around the fire talking for hours. At one point, I got up to use the bathroom, and when I got back, he had gotten up and was standing about 15 feet away, kind of overlooking this pond that we had camped near. And as I got closer, there was a couple moments of silence, and then he just kind of matter-of-factly just said, so I've been seeing these strange lights in the sky on my hikes recently. I remember I didn't say anything at first, and then I just kind of blurted out, oh, you mean like the northern lights? And he didn't say anything, and he just kind of turned around. I remember the blank expression he had on his face, and I knew that he wasn't talking about the northern lights. So then he proceeded to tell me about these 2 incidents that he had in the months prior to our trip. On each occasion, he would be out hiking, and he would get this feeling of being watched. And then a few moments later would see this orb appear out of nowhere, and would see it move around for a little bit before disappearing. And he said the first time it happened, it only lasted a few seconds. And then the second time was longer, it was like 15 seconds. And then it would split into 2 orbs before disappearing. I remember just taking a moment to just kind of process everything, because it was weird for kind of Owen or to hear it coming out of his mouth. Then I remember asking, did you just see something? Is that why you're bringing this up? And he said no, he hadn't that evening, but just felt that I was someone that he could trust with this information. I remember at the time, I UFOs weren't even on my radar. I said, I think you did see something real, but I don't really kind of believe in UFOs, and I'd need to either experience something myself or would need some kind of compelling proof. And he understood, and we just kind of left it at that and went back to hanging out. And stayed up a little longer to talk, and got up the next day as if nothing had happened, and just did a small hike. I remember on the way back to Owen's house, we made plans to do another hike as soon as we could. And this time we wanted to do, it was a canoe trip in Maine. We wanted to do some backwoods canoeing and camping. And then we got to his house and I got in my car and he was standing on his steps. And as I drove off, we waved. And that was the last time I saw Owen. We emailed back and forth for a couple of weeks, making plans, getting our gear list for this camping trip and kind of figuring out where exactly we'd go. And then I just happened to twist my ankle on a hike. And that was it. And I was laid up for a couple of months because it was a pretty bad sprain. And we kind of lost touch. I can't help but think that if we hadn't, maybe Owen would still be here. I think for most people, what happened to Owen comes down to the night he was last seen and what happened when his car was heard driving off in the middle of the night. Was it Owen who was driving off voluntarily, or was he somehow being taken somewhere by force? When his family checked his home after not hearing from him for a few days, they found his cell phone and wallet were still inside, and there was no evidence to suggest that he'd been planning a hike or a trip. And maybe even more importantly, his outdoor gear and all of his equipment was still neatly stored. So all of this would suggest some sort of an unplanned departure. But his door was found unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry or missing items, so it wasn't a robbery. There was also no evidence of struggle, and Owen's neighbors hadn't heard any unusual sounds or voices coming from his house. So what then would compel Owen to leave other than maybe by knife or gunpoint? Well, the thing is that Springfield, Massachusetts, where Owen lived, was still fighting the opioid epidemic and had a high crime rate. So local police suspected that Owen had surprised armed thieves trying to steal his car and was carjacked as a result. And they continued their investigation accordingly. His family and friends offered a reward and then put up flyers and canvassed Springfield and the surrounding towns, but they didn't end up uncovering any new clues or information. And then 2 weeks later, his car would be found 90 miles away in the Green Mountains of Vermont, parked at a trailhead with its windows and doors wide open. And the police immediately started searching the area where the car was found, and his family and friends were given this brief glimmer of hope. It had rained the night before, which washed away any evidence, given the car had been left with its windows and doors open. Police were quickly able to determine that the car had been only parked there within 24 hours of being discovered. So either Owen had gone AWOL for 2 weeks before showing up in southern Vermont, or it was someone else who left his car there. The condition of the car when found and the location's proximity to I-91, a drug trafficking highway, all seemed to confirm the police's suspicions that Owen had interrupted thieves trying to steal his car and was likely kidnapped and killed as a result. His car then abandoned in Vermont sometime later. They ended up calling off the search and rescue teams after about 48 hours. But Owen's friends and family continued searching the Green Mountains for several months before finally giving up hope. And this is where most people believe the trail for Owen ends. I found out that Owen was missing about a month after he was last seen, which was about 2 weeks after his car was discovered abandoned. After we'd spent the previous year out of touch, I was really looking forward to reaching out to him and reconnecting and getting back on track with our plans to go camping up in Maine. And I shot him an email and didn't hear back for a week, and then I followed up with another email and then ended up calling him, and his mailbox was full, and 2 weeks' time had passed. And I finally just called his neighbor and was like, hey, have you seen Owen? Is everything cool? And that's when I found out the news that not only had Owen been missing for a month, but that police suspected he was already dead. I was just floored. We'd only hung out a handful of times in the 7-8 years we'd known each other, but I was convinced that we would be friends for life. And I immediately felt guilty for not getting in touch sooner and falling out of touch in the first place and not hanging out with Owen more when I had the chance. And then I found out the details and the circumstances, and I just entered this state of denial. It didn't make any sense to me. Owen was level-headed and methodical and extremely cautious. I didn't really see how he would just let himself get involved in a situation like that. I mean, if he heard someone trying to break into his car, he would just call the police. He wouldn't try to confront them. Owen was just non-confrontational and would always kind of do the right thing or the safe thing. What had struck me as weird since I found out the details of his disappearance was where his car was discovered abandoned. It was a trailhead parking lot. I couldn't help but think that he could have gone there on his own. So then I started thinking that maybe police had got something wrong, or maybe they missed some clue, or just didn't care enough. Then I started thinking about other possible explanations, just not wanting to believe that he was gone. Maybe Owen had some sort of psychotic episode, and something triggered him to have this mental break, and he just drove off. 2 weeks later, ended up in the woods and just escaped into the wilderness, never to be found. Then about a week and a half after finding out, I kind of just more or less accepted the police's explanation. I knew that the city that he lived in had a particular history with drug-related crime, and I just kind of resolved myself to the fact that Owen was gone, and I wasn't going to see him again. And then kind of a few days after I had made this realization, I was going through my phone, just going through old text messages from Owen, and I randomly checked voicemail, and I saw that I had this unplayed message from him, and quickly realized that it was left about a week and a half before he was reported missing. And when I listened to it, it changed everything. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of the Where the Trail Ends podcast. Please help me by subscribing and sharing this podcast with others. If you have information about or have experienced any of the phenomenon mentioned in this podcast, please email wherethetrailendspodcast@gmail.com. On the next episode of Where the Trail Ends, an overlooked voicemail leads me to a shocking discovery that starts me on my search for the truth about my missing friend and the apparent evidence of UFOs they left behind.